It's almost 14 years since the occupation of Afghanistan began, ostensibly to free a grateful people from the oppression of the Taliban and to bring the plotters of the September 11th attacks to justice. This war was supposed to be over. It was supposed to have been concluded when the Taliban forces fled to Pakistan and BBC journalist John Simpson sailed into Kabul with the troops declaring that it was extraordinarily exhilarating to be liberating a city. It should have been over within the first year, during which epidemiologists say about 10,000 people died as a result of the war, although, as Bob Dreyfus and Nick Turse write in The Nation, civilian casualties in Afghanistan are rarely acknowledged in the media. Even among staunchly anti-war politicians and pundits, few bothered to mention the cost to Afghans. It should have been over when a previously little-known member of the Northern Alliance of warlords opposed to the Taliban, with a link to the CIA, Hamid Karzai, was hand-picked by the US, groomed, given an Armani makeover, and set up as the interim leader of the country. Or when national elections were first held in 2004, supposedly marking the triumph of democracy. But over a decade later, the war goes on, with new deaths a regular occurrence. The Taliban is still making advances, and Hamid Karzai is still hoovering up CIA money, according to CNN. Obama plans to have withdrawn by 2016, but has abruptly decided to keep thousands of troops in place in order to prevent the government from collapsing. So while the media tends to report on eye-catching events such as major battles or top political decisions, there's very little explanation of what has actually been done to Afghanistan. As Greg Shupak writes for Jacobin magazine, the country has the worst rate of infant mortality in the world, unemployment and crime are rising, 60% of children are malnourished, and only 27% of the population has access to safe drinking water. The government of Afghanistan barely functions, is utterly dependent on aid, having already swallowed up $100 billion of US aid, much of it, as Nick Turse reports at Tom Dispatch, for US military purposes. Its survival is precarious at best. What is happening in Afghanistan is a military and political defeat for the United States, following a protracted debacle that has extracted severe costs for Afghan society. And this is something that large sections of the media can neither explain nor accept. One of the few genuinely insightful reporters from the front lines in Afghanistan, Anand Gopal, described how this had happened for Tom Dispatch. While the US military leadership insisted that sustained military occupation could crush the remnants of the Taliban, the story from the grassroots was that the warlords, empowered by the occupiers, were just as brutal as the power they replaced. And that is why, slowly but surely, ordinary people began to take up arms against the occupiers. Even the notoriously repressive vice and virtue squads upholding the morality of the most reactionary sections of Afghan society, which were supposed to have been liquidated with the end of the Taliban, resurfaced. As Time magazine reported, they were repackaged under a new name. One aspect of the US counterinsurgency was a supposed anti-drugs policy wherein the corporation DINCOR was employed by the US to spray poison on opium farms, which, said the FT, made up a third of total income in the country. In fact, as in Plan Colombia, where these methods were used as part of a counterinsurgency strategy by the US, it was largely the farms of the poor which were targeted, while the bigger farms owned by the warlords supporting the occupation regime tended to be left alone. As a result of all this, and the corruption and brutality of the new warlord-led administration, some of which was exposed by WikiLeaks, shown here by The Guardian, the Taliban first began to make a serious comeback, concentrated initially in the south of Afghanistan, in 2006. If one depended solely on the media's representations of what was taking place, one wouldn't understand the depth of this. By 2007, in a barely acknowledged report, the Senlis Council had estimated that 54% of the country had a Taliban presence, and it was no longer limited to the south. Likewise, the soaring rate of airstrikes, described in a report by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and their grave humanitarian consequences were hardly mentioned in news reports at all, which focused on Taliban atrocities. As the US academic Mark Herold wrote, the media was all too willing to repeat military propaganda, so that when the US carried out a major massacre in Hejan, It was reported at first as a surgically precise strike on Taliban targets. Gradually, as the counterinsurgency floundered, military leaders adopted a tribal explanation of the insurgency. The head of the British Armed Forces, General Sir Richard Dannatt, said in a speech reported in The Guardian that the great majority of the people the coalition was fighting were aligned with the Taliban for financial, social and tribal reasons. The Tory official formerly responsible for managing British imperial interests in southern Iraq, Rory Stewart, argued in The Guardian that the people the Americans and the British are fighting in Afghanistan are mostly local tribesmen resisting foreign forces. Finally, in 2010, the BBC reported on statistical evidence confirming the patently obvious, which somehow had eluded all the media and war planners up to this point. The more the US bombings killed civilians, the more the local populations joined the Taliban to fight the occupation. In 2009, the incoming Obama administration decided to adopt a new foreign policy strategy. Gradually withdrawing forces from Iraq, it placed a new emphasis on winning in Afghanistan and later declared a pivot to Asia, which is likely to be the crux of new growth in the world economy. Obama predicated this strategic shift in Afghanistan on a new realism. As The Guardian reported, notable by its absence in any of the speeches from the American team was any mention of building democracy in Afghanistan, the supposed raison d'etre for the occupation thus far. With the Bush era's military adventurism in tatters, the idea of democracy promotion through military conquest seriously discredited and the Pentagon budget under pressure, the US admitted that it would have to negotiate with sections of the Taliban, again shown here by The Guardian. As part of its transition, the administration shifted its zone of operations to neighbouring Pakistan and began to escalate drone strikes, despite complaints from the Pakistani government that the violations of national sovereignty and the casualties were weakening the government's legitimacy. The shift to drone warfare was supposed to enable surgical precision in targeting Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and as Glenn Greenwald pointed out for Salon, the US media dutifully reported that the dead were militants, without any clue as to who they were. In fact, The Guardian reported that the human rights group Reprieve found that for all the bluff about surgical strikes hitting just the bad guys, the US had specifically targeted 41 men, but actually killed thousands of people. They noted that 28 people targeted in Pakistan were all reported in the press, evidently regurgitating Pentagon propaganda, as having been killed multiple times. In fact, the Obama administration had to redefine the category of civilian in its drone war, as only a few journalists, such as Chris Woods at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, reported. They justified their killings by determining that a combatant was any male of military age, that is, over the age of 15. Not everyone wants to admit to defeat. Forbes magazine has offered 5 reasons Afghanistan is becoming an American success story. These include the claim that the security forces built up by the US are performing well. In fact, although officials continue to make this claim to Congress, a secret Pentagon report shows that this is not the case. As the Denver Post reports, the development of these security forces has failed to significantly stem the insurgency, with some units becoming deeply entangled in criminal activity, including bribe-taking and extortion. In truth, the administration, which hung on to the goal of winning through counterinsurgency for as long as it could, has given up. By the end of 2016, the US is supposed to have reduced its troop levels to normal embassy levels. This withdrawal was supposed to be conditional upon security and development goals, but these, as Thomas Ruttig at the Afghanistan Analyst Network writes, no longer apply. Demands for reform addressed at the Afghan government were practically dropped, while the US prepared to gloss the performance of the Afghan security forces. The problem is that the US has spent a total of $100 billion in Afghanistan, according to Business Insider, all to build up a government that is now totally politically and economically dependent on its imperial sponsors, and which might fail at any moment. The Economist reports that the extent of the country's dependency is equivalent to that of Gaza and the West Bank, under total Israeli domination and economic blockade. Given such a huge financial, political, and military investment, much of the Washington establishment is reluctant to give up. And much of the press, particularly the liberal end of the press, is anxious that the US should not abandon Afghanistan. Peter Bergen, writing for CNN, says, "Abandon Afghanistan? A dumb idea." Michael O'Hanlon, writing for the Washington Post, likewise argues that the US should not abandon Afghanistan. Dawood Moradian, writing for Foreign Policy magazine, explains why the US cannot abandon Afghanistan. Esquire magazine even brings up the old so-called pottery barn rule. You break it, you own it. But does the US own Afghanistan? This talk of abandonment is not new. At the height of France's war to keep Algeria French, the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre pointed out the racism of this trope. People who talk of the abandonment of Algeria, he said, are imbeciles. There's no abandoning what we have never owned.